Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us for a webinar today about best practice SAP role redesign. We're gonna wait another minute or so, or maybe slightly less, because there are still a lot of folks joining as I speak. So we'll give them a chance to settle in, and we'll then start probably about 1 minute past. Well, at 1:31 Eastern, we'll start. All right, let's get started. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today to this exciting webinar, no pun intended, but best practice SAP role redesign. Our speaker today is going to be Jeff Porter, our senior security consultant. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to make you aware of. We'll record this webinar, and so you can you get a link with the recording, I think within 24 hours, directly from GoToMeeting, or GoToWebinar. So look out for that email. Also, we have a limit, unfortunately, on how many people can join. And last time we hit that limit, we might hit it today as well. So if you have any colleagues or friends who wanted to join but can't, apologize in advance, but they'll get the recording obviously as well. Also, if you have any questions during the webinar, if anything is unclear what Jeff says or shows, please feel free to use the questions panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. Should be on the right-hand side by default, so you can just expand that questions box and type in your question there. We'll do our best to monitor those questions, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. If we don't get to any of your questions, don't worry, we'll send you an email with the answer. In fact, we'll send an email with all the questions and all the answers, so everyone knows what everyone asked and can see the corresponding answer. Last but not least, we will have 3 polling questions throughout the webinar. Please participate and submit your answer. I'll show the results right after the polling, so we'll give it maybe 10 to 20 seconds for everyone to submit the answer or the feedback, and then we'll show the results to everyone. So hopefully we can learn all a little bit about where you stand with your role design, etc. And with that said, Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you do your thing, and I'll jump back in when the polling time comes around.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started with the best practice SAP role redesign. This is the first webinar in a 2-part series. And so the next one we'll talk about at the end of this webinar when it comes up. And why are we not moving now? There we go. So a little bit about our company. We were founded in 2008 by a group of SAP security experts. We're headquartered in Switzerland. We're up to about 70, it's actually a little bit more than that, employees. We have offices in Germany, Switzerland, England, Romania, and of course here in the United States. And most of the senior consultants, we all do SAP training as well. So you can find a lot of us out on teaching SAP courses and some of our own courses during the year, whether you get them through SAP Education or not. We're also an SAP Silver Partner. And so we have a pretty good relationship with SAP. All right, so the agenda for today is we're going to talk about some fundamentals of SAP authorization management, and then we'll talk about some of the best practice approach for authorization redesigns. We'll look at optimization of your custom developments. That's your custom code, your custom transactions, those kind of things. Testing of your redesigned roles and some of the issues around that. And then kind of a wrap up. And as Michael said, there's some polling questions in between here as well. So probably the biggest thing that you can do to enhance your SAP security processes is to maintain your Su24 transactions or your Su24 values. The Su24 is basically your lowest common denominator, and when you're in the profile generator and you add a transaction or a function module or something to the menu, When you save that and go to the Authorizations tab, you can use the read only or the read old merge new functionality. And what that does, it goes out to SU24 and it brings in all of the default objects that are required for that transaction or that object. If you maintain those correctly, it really cuts down on the amount of work you have to do for your authorizations, the post maintenance of them. And it also helps an awful lot if you get ready to go do an S4 HANA migration. This is a big step. The cleaner your roles, the better your migration process will be, the easier it will be. If your roles are filled with a lot of manual and changed authorizations, it becomes kind of a nightmare to figure out if the authorizations are required or if they're there for some old reason that may have been removed in the past. It's kind of the way it works is that in SU24, which is really the front end to maintaining two US OBT tables, you define what checks, what authorization checks do you want to actually have proposed for your roles, and the values. For instance, you could have, for table, you could have S-taboo nom, you could have that inserted into your role automatically when you put in SE16 with a table name, right? That automatically gets put into the transaction and the authorization is built when you go through Profile Generator correctly, if you maintain it in SU24. You can also turn off authorization checks. Say you have some like S-taboo CLI, for instance. You may not want that as part of yours. You can turn that authorization check off as well, and when you add a transaction that requires it or doesn't require it, it won't come into the transaction. It won't come into your authorizations in the Profile Generator. All of those are maintained in SU24. The problem becomes maintaining them, right? So, for instance, one of the biggest issues that comes up is S-program and S-taboo, the authorization groups. Those change quite dynamically, right? Throughout the course, the business always goes through the programmers, asks that a program auth group be changed so it's in its own auth group, but nobody tells security, right? And so now your SU24 values are out of sync with what the actual program authorization group is, and when you insert a transaction that calls that program into your role, you get the wrong auth group because it's not maintained, right? So the better you can maintain this, the easier your life will be with the post-maintenance of authorizations. And with that, it looks like we have our first poll. Michael?
Yes, so the first polling question is, do you maintain SU24? Just like to get an understanding of who actively maintains that. We've seen in the past that many customers don't for various reasons. So I'd like to get a better understanding of where you guys stand with that. And we see polls coming in. It looks like many of you do have a solid SU24. So we'll close that poll here in a second, and then I'll show the results so we all can see what's going on. So I'm going to close it and share. So as you can see, there are 36% have a solid SU24. That's pretty good. That's more than what we usually see. And same percentage apparently doesn't. And some don't maintain SU24 at all. And you'll get those polling results in at the end as well. So don't worry. Don't have to take a screenshot if you don't want to.
All right.
And with it, back to you, Jeff.
All right. And so the objectives of your authorization concept, obviously it's to risk minimization. You want to minimize the risk of SAP security violations, whether that be through audits or just protecting your system. It's a common problem. We'll talk about here in a little bit the different role designs. It's a common problem that users get over-authorized, especially your RFC users, your batch users. They tend to be really hard to authorize correctly, so they get pretty wide open access. And unfortunately here lately, especially with GDPR and a few of the other licensing models that are coming from SAP, that's going to cause a lot of problems for you in the future. Your migration to S4 HANA, those wide open authorizations could cause a lot of issues when you go forward. So that's kind of the first thing you need to kind of watch is the security. You want minimal amounts. SAP is going to what they call the object of one, right? The concept of one, which is really granular type access. Some of you might have seen that the S-taboo checks are changing, right? It used to be S-taboo dis was checked first and then S-taboo nom. On some of your systems, when you go out and look in some of the later systems, you might now see that S-taboo nom is the first thing that is checked. taboo dis is checked after taboo nom. And next to taboo dis is a little comment that says that authorization object is now obsolete, right? So I don't know what SAP's plans are for that, but you can see coming down in the future that they may end up doing away with taboo dis. The authorization group concept may go away, and you may have to start doing very granular access to tables, right? So just keep that in mind when you're looking at it. The next thing you want to consider when you're doing your authorization is transparency. And really that comes into play in two areas. The biggest area that comes into play is with your role owners, and when they have to come out and finally ask, I need to give a user certain access, right? The transparency of what a role actually does is paramount. It has to be easy for your role owners and the people requesting this access to know what your roles are doing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about role design. So transparency, what is this actually able to do? Again, I'll harp on the authorization group concept with taboo. When you look at, for instance, auth group SS, there's hundreds of tables in that auth group. So if you're giving somebody access to SS, you're giving them access to an awful lot of table data. It's becoming more and more important to be very granular with the table access that you allow them to use, okay? And then another one is consistency and stability. How easy is it to, to maintain this, right? Consistency and maintainability kind of go same hand in hand. The roles aren't static. Once you get done with the role redesign, you got to live with them, right? And you got to be able to maintain them, right? How consistent are the role designs across all the different areas? Are you following the same concept with your roles? Some of them may be using composite roles, while another group may be using single job roles, and another one may be using enabler or task-based roles. In order to maintain your roles correctly, you need to kind of follow the same concept throughout your system. And then that comes down to maintainability. When you're doing your role redesign, don't think just about the current roles you're building. Think very much about how maintainable is that later on. Because typically what happens is your senior security folks end up doing your role redesign, but the maintenance a lot of times gets handed off to junior consultants or junior security folks later who may not understand the full impact of Profile Generator and how it works and how it connects. So your roles can get off track really quick if it's not maintained correctly. Okay, so your scalability, you're going to divest companies, you're going to buy companies, those kind of things when you get new concepts in. How easy is your role concept and your authorization concept to apply to new companies that come in? All things to think about. All right, so now let's start talking about the best practice approach for authorization redesigns. This is kind of a big topic with a lot of folks, especially now with S/4HANA coming along. All right, so first we have to decide what are the reasons we're doing this upgrade? What are the reasons we're changing our role redesign, right? And it could be because of an upgrade. We could be going from a standard ERP system up to S/4HANA with Fiori at this point, right? That's a different concept in a way. You want to standardize your role concept. Maybe it's kind of got off the rails and you want to go to a new concept because it's been around for 20 years and we now need to incorporate some new design. You may have fragmented role structure, right? So like I was talking about, you may have one group that's using composite roles and another group that's using single job roles, and you want to get them all on the same kind of bandwagon. And then simplify your role administration, right? That's the big one, especially with composite roles. That's where you see a lot of problems with role administration, is with composite roles. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. Compliance with legal requirements for the oil industry, the energy department, defense contractors. Everybody has legal compliance that we have to deal with now. Your GDPR, if you're doing business abroad, that's a big thing at this point as well. Your change of the organizational structure. Maybe you sold off a company, maybe you're inheriting a company. You've brought a company in and now you've got to get their security built into your system. And maybe they built their roles different than your standard, and now you've got to get them back to the way that you want to do business. Okay, compliance of separation of your functions, so your SOD type stuff, mixed in with GRC. You may have some risk-based, you may have some audit issues you have to go remediate now. A couple of things that aren't on this slide now is the SAP licensing model. Last year when we gave this, we announced the 2018 that SAP had come out with this really new licensing model that everybody was going to have to jump into which basically said it's no longer based off of what you do in the system. Your license, your pricing is going to be based off of what you're authorized to do. That caused a lot of headaches for SAP, and they backed off of that a little bit. So now you have till 2020 when they stop support for the ERP systems, the ECC systems, and everybody has to be on HANA. You have to opt into this now, right? So you have to decide how you're going to do this model. So if you're going to base all of your S-law reviews off of what you're authorized to do, and you're over-authorized everywhere, you now have a big licensing impact on your hands. So you may have a remodel on that. And the other place that this is hitting is GDPR, right? So you now have to be able to ensure what roles have access to GDPR data, right? So you have to be able to tell the auditors when they walk in the door which roles have this access, right? Which of my function modules, which one of those function modules are accessing GDPR data? You have to be able to tell them that as well. So one of the first things I've been hearing from our clients abroad is one of the first things the auditors come in and ask for is show me your documented RFC connections. Show me the documentation for your RFC connections that have access to GDPR data. So we're seeing a lot of that come around too. Those are all things that are spurring on these new role redesigns. And with that, we have yet another poll.
All right, thanks, Jeff. And also, I heard one person saying that the audio quality is really bad. I can hear you very well, but if any of you have issues, please submit it as a question. I'm not sure if there is anything that I can do at this point, but I hope you're all hearing Jeff well. And with that, we have the polling question is, how old is your current role design? Is it, you just completed a redesign maybe? Is it older, super old, or you don't know? So let us know, please. All right, and the results are almost in. I'm gonna close the poll and share the results. So a good quarter just completed a redesign, and then there is a big chunk with redesign. It's over 10 years old, 41%. That's quite a bit, and that's what we typically see. And with that, back to you, Jeff.
Okay. All right, so some influencing factors. We talked a little bit just a while ago about that, but we'll run through this pretty quick. So things that you kind of need to think about when you're doing your redesign, things that can influence your design. Are you creating roles that have create versus change or display access? Are you building based off of a module view, right? So do you want to build your roles so they're based on module, or do you want to build it based off of process? And then the different layers. Is this role going to be used and assigned in development in your QA or your production? Typically, your development and QA roles have a lot more access, and they're a little more flexible than your production access, especially for your basis and your security people. You usually have a lot in your developers that usually have a lot more access in dev and QA. So think about that. That should also tie into your naming standards, right? So you should be able to tell if a role is only supposed to be used in a dev and a QA environment versus what should be used in a prod environment. Organizational structures that can influence your role design quite a bit as well, like company code, plant, warehouse, those kind of things. The different types of data that it accesses, right? Is it master data, transactional data? Is it customizing, developer kind of stuff? And then any kind of criticality type stuff, like from regulations or SOD type stuff, your SOX, your GDPR, those kind of things. Those can all influence your design as well. So this next slide is one that talks mainly about the role design. And if you could put 5 people in a room, security people in a room, and talk about role design theory, you'd get 5 different answers on what they think the best is. SAP's best practice is to build single job roles. That is their best practice going forward. That term gets kind of messy though, right? So what defines a job is a little bit different, and how you split that out gets a little bit shady. But essentially their best practice idea is to have single roles that encompass everything a user needs to do in a job. That's kind of my favorite take on it. When I build roles, I tend to build everything for a job into a single role. Now, let's talk about that little concept. So that concept of a single role for a job, for me, doesn't include inherent SODs, right? So if you have SODs and all of the stuff that a person who is an accountant would need to do, obviously you got to split that into some other roles. But the jobs should all be pretty much named the same, and maybe, you know, job role 1 of 3, 1 of, or 2 of 3, 3 of 3, that kind of stuff. But I like to see all of my roles for a job, for a particular person or particular position in a company. I like those all to be in 1 or 2 or 3 roles at most. And the reason I do that is for transparency, right? I don't want to have to drill down into a composite role and all its various components and roles to try and figure out what this one role can do. It also comes down to very easy for somebody to be a role owner, because they have a very small role to look at for a job, and they know exactly what that role does. There's no, you know, there's no messy, cloudy, shady stuff there. It's very straightforward, very transparent what that role can do. It's also the easiest role to support long term. If somebody comes to you and tells you that there's a change that needs to happen to this role, you know exactly where to do it. You know exactly what role to go touch and what to change. It's very straightforward. Even your junior consultants don't have to make a decision at this point as to what role that needs to be updated. As you'll see with some of the other type roles, it becomes kind of convoluted and has impacts. So that's my take on single roles. That's SAP's best practice. It's their stated best practice for role design. Now, composite roles are basically a combination of single roles that are shared, typically across multiple composite roles, and rolled up into one master role, if you will, the composite role. So that's actually, it's very common. There's a lot of companies that use it, and I'm not a fan of it myself, typically for the maintenance side of it. The maintenance of a composite role becomes very messy very quickly. All right, it can get out of hand very quickly. And the problem becomes that when you need to make a change to one of the roles that is in a composite role, you're not changing just that composite role. You're changing the security content for multiple composite roles if that role is shared across multiple composite roles. And so you can quickly get into a lot of roles. Your roles can expand very quickly because you may want to add a T code to this one composite role. So now you have to create a separate role, right? So now you get one more role because you can't have it in these other 2 roles. So it gets ugly very quick. The one place that I'm kind of a fan of composite roles is back when we were talking about single roles. If I make a job role, a single job role, and it has inherent SODs in it, and I make 3 versions of that role, and I pull out the offending SOD issues, right? So I have a main job role, and then I have a second one that has, you know, one of the SOD issues, and then another one that pulled out another SOD issue. There are times when I will make a composite role for just that job, right? The caveat to that is I will not use any of those single roles in any other composite role. They're not shared across the system. All right, so that's kind of my take on a composite role. Technically, it's a composite role, but all of the single roles underneath it are only assigned to that one composite role. They're not shared across the spectrum of composite roles. And with that, your structure becomes very clear. Again, it's very strict. And in that way, composite roles can work for you. Okay, recent and forecasted changes to the SAP user license model with this can also be a troublemaker. Right, so we were talking earlier about the licensing being an issue, and that it's based on what you're authorized to do. Composite roles are notorious for growing very large and having lots of access. If all SAP comes around and automatically switches everybody to what you're authorized to do, you're going to have a problem in that all your roles are now way over authorized, and everybody's going to be professional user. Excuse me. The last type of role that we'll talk about is enabler roles. This is a minimum of 2 roles, and typically it's all of your tasks are in one role, and then all of the organizational stuff is in the other. And so it's a combination of 2 roles that gives you access to whatever a user needs to do. This is probably the worst design ever. This one basically leads to very huge roles very quick. I have seen with my own eyes a lot of clients that have blown out their number range using this type of role model, simply because the organizational side changes so much, and you just keep building roles, and it's hard to maintain. It's hard. There's no transparency. The transparency is very, very close to nothing, and it's hard for you to maintain. It's hard for users to request. And it's hard to make changes when the org structure changes. Right, that's another thing that just destroys this concept. So stay away from enable roles if you can possibly do it at all costs. It's one of the worst models out there. Okay. All right, so role concept considerations. Driving reasons for the implementation of new authorization concept. Organizational access, regulatory changes, and then the maintenance, ease of maintenance in your audit remediation, right? So that's one of the biggest driving reasons of a new authorization concept. We have to remediate audit issues, or there's been some new, like GDPR has come through, and now it's a big thing. We got to remediate that. Ensure that role definitions match the real transaction usage, all right? So when you're actually getting ready to do your role redesign, we're all familiar with sitting in a room with the business and saying, all right, tell us what you need, right? And they typically have some idea, but not a great idea, right? And then your testing becomes long and arduous because they forgot to tell you about certain things, or they want to make changes. Use ST03N or GRC access, your GRC data, as best you can. You want to narrow down the scope of your project as much as you can. So you want to use what the folks have been doing. So your ST03N data is your best bet. You can base it off of their usage data. Right, so you don't want too much or too little authorizations. We're all kind of familiar with that. Hang on once. All right. So identification of common job roles. Again, I'm a huge fan of job-specific roles. Position-based security is typically what it's called. You can use PPOME, the transaction in the HR system, and it'll tell you all the jobs that are out there. It's a good place to start to build your jobs. When we talk at the next webinar, we're going to use some other tools that can help you figure that out as well. It's not uncommon to create generic access for all users. So you have like the all user role that has like the SAP Office Mail, the SGUI, that kind of stuff. That's a good thing to do as well. Display only roles, I'm 50-50 on that. Display only roles for certain applications is fine. So if you're the FI team, they typically have their own display only role that they'll give to folks. And that works. A lot of times I've seen it work both pro and con, both ways. So I don't have a best practice on that one. You can do whatever you want with that as far as I'm concerned. Me personally, I like to put all the display transactions in each job role. It's a little more maintenance. Again, it's a little more maintenance on my side as a security administrator, but it helps with transparency. And I focus a lot of my role design on post redesign. What makes it easier for the role designers and the role folks that are going to maintain this at the end of the day? What makes it easier for them to do their job? Adding authorizations or a T code to a role isn't mechanically that big of a deal. It doesn't take that long to do, especially if your Su24 values are in check. So I like the transparency that it gives me having it all in one role. But I'm also aware that a lot of companies do a display only for each application. That's fine. Ooh, man. Hang on a second. My screen just went crazy. Sorry about that. My screen has gone kind of haywire here. We're there, display owners. Okay, other considerations. Ease of role maintenance and concept, we talked about that, right? How easy, once you've built this design, how easy is it to maintain when you have things like upgrades? How easy is it to maintain when you have divestiture? So when you've sold off a portion of your company, or you inherit a new company, you bought a company, and you got to bring their system onto yours. Your system and your authorization concept should allow for that to be as easy as possible. Again, this all really goes back to Su24. Su24 plays a big part in making this an easier thing to do. Especially with the S/4HANA migration, you'll see that that's a huge area as well. The SAP license cost. We've kind of talked about that a little bit. That is going to become more and more of an issue as we get along the SAP licensing model. In 2020, I suspect that this is going to become another big topic when everybody's forced into a certain license type. Your S-Law reviews will start being a little bit more challenging. So keep in mind when you're building your roles, what's the cost of the license? When I assign this role to somebody, what's it going to cost? Again, here, transparency with the single job role becomes paramount, right? If you have one role to look at, it's very easy to decide what it's going to cost to give to a user, right? If a user is in this job, I have one role to look at and evaluate. I don't have 15 in a composite role that I have to try and figure out now. What's that going to do to this role, right? What's it going to cost when I assign this to a user? Am I going to violate my contract with SAP, right? So with SAP, if I've only got 15 professional users and I'm assigning over authorized roles and now I have 500 of them, you're going to get a nice big bill from SAP the next time they do their S-Law review. Okay, and then of course SOD issues. We're all familiar with the SOD issues, right? So you have to keep those in check. Technically, you should be looking at your SOD infractions as you're designing your role, right? You don't want to go live. Usually, before you can go live, your auditors have to be proven. You have to prove to your auditors that you have no inherent SODs in the roles. That's usually a requirement, a sign-off requirement for going live. Technically, you should be doing it as you're doing the development. Depending on how easy, GRC makes that a pretty easy thing to do. All right, optimization of custom development. So another thing you have to worry about, and it's very common, is the custom programs, your custom T codes, and looking at those. It's not only important to ensure that they're properly coded, like the return handling, like the return code is handled correctly. When we scan code with our tool, we find that that is a huge, huge issue with custom code. A lot of times your developers will put in an authority check, but they won't tell the program how to handle the return code that comes back when the authority check is done. So essentially, that's not an authority check. You'll always pass. They'll never fail that way because it doesn't know how to handle the return code. That's a big problem that we see a lot of. So you need to make sure that your code is properly scanned and looked at and secured. Another area where I see a lot of issues is with TSTCA check. A lot of people are not familiar with what a TSTCA check, but in short, it's an authority check that happens on the transaction before the program the transaction calls is brought up, right? So the first thing that happens when you call a transaction, I'll use SU01. SU01, the kernel goes out and makes sure that the key code that you entered is a valid key code. If it is, it checks to see if it's locked. If it's not locked, it then goes out and it looks at the transaction itself, like an SE93, to see if there is another security authorization check that needs to happen. That's called a TSTCA check. It is not coded into the program that the transaction is calling. It is part of the transaction. It checks if there's one possible. It checks to see if you have that object. With SU01, I think it's SUser group that is called. It checks to see if you have at least that object in your user buffer. Okay. What a lot of developers will go out and do is they will get an audit finding saying this program does not have an authority check. You need to code an authority check, and you'll get a finding for that. So what they'll do, because it's easy to do, is they'll go out and they'll dump a TSTCA check on the transaction. That does not satisfy the audit requirement because you're not coding an authority check into the program. If somebody writes another T code that calls that program, you're back to not having an authority check done in that transaction or in that program. All right, so TSTCA checks are something you need to pay attention to. SU24 has it in there, so you can code it part of the SU24 transaction, but keep in mind that it does not satisfy audit requirements. Okay. Analysis of custom developments. Depending on what you're using for your code scanning, it can be a big project. I mean, it can be a project onto itself, actually. So you need automated tools for code scanning. Particularly for security administrators, you need code scanners that are tuned to authority checks, right? And that's not all of the code scanners out there do this. The exciting one, which we'll talk about the next webinar, our ABAP Alchemist, it has a unique feature in that it will scan for missing authority checks. So if you're accessing table data, it will, and there's no authority check around that, it'll suggest an authority check, and it'll tell you what that authority check should be. So we'll see that in the next webinar. And so it's not uncommon for auditors to walk in and focus on custom code and make sure that it's commonly coded. So you really need to get your SU24 values documented for these custom objects. And the other thing is you, as a security manager, you need to get involved in the development process. And that's sometimes very difficult things to do at a company. All right, so when they're building new code, your security team should be inserted into that process. If they're building a new program, a custom program, or a custom transaction for the business, you should be part of that process to ensure that the security is being checked in that. Okay, that's sometimes very difficult to do. The developers sometimes work in a vacuum and they don't necessarily get security involved when we should be. The typical call you'll get is the business calling after the programmers have moved it to production and they tell you they don't have access, right? Hey, they just moved this to production, we don't have access to it. And then you're left wondering what it is they've even moved, right? You don't know anything about it. Okay, so you need to get yourself inserted in that just to save yourself headaches. Okay, so there's the dependency between the process and the security concept we talked about a little bit already. The other thing you need to keep in mind, besides the authority check statements in the SU20, is your programming table auth groups. Who in your company defines those? Is it the developers that define table auth groups for the programs and stuff, or do you make those as the security team? And then your naming standards. Not just the naming standards around the roles, but there should be naming standards around those auth groups for the programs and who develops those. You should have all of that in one document, right, for the naming standards. Usually, though, the program and table auth groups naming standards, those are typically in the development guidelines. Okay, as a security team, when I'm supposed to authorize, especially for programs, I need to know what those auth groups are and what the naming convention is so I can properly secure it or suggest proper security auth groups for those. So try and get yourself inserted into the development process. All right, so testing and redesign. Okay, so the testing part, we've made a change to our role, now we need to test it. This has issues in multiple areas. First and foremost is the business doesn't like to test, right? Even if they're the ones that requested it, they have a job to do, and dropping everything that they're doing and coming over to a QA system to test a role for us is typically not at the top of their list. They're usually really nice about it and they do it, but their heart's not really in because they're thinking about going back to their desk and doing their job, right? I need to do my work, and now I'm doing securities work testing this thing. You need to do both the positive and negative testing, right? So we need to know what it can do, what it can't do, make sure that we're not over-authorizing, especially if you're using ranges. And then we need to scan for SODs, SOX compliance, those kind of issues. And it's not uncommon for a rush testing environment, so lack of testing, in other words, to cause a lot of your go-live emergencies, right? There's just not enough time to design and retest all of these roles. And so that's kind of one of the big issues with the go live. And that now breeds the second issue with the go live, right? Is that they know, the business knows, when we go live with new world, there's going to be issues. There's going to be a lot of problems. My work is going to get immensely more complex because I'm going to have to stop and contact security and wait for a transport while they fix things. And I can't do my job. Right, so you have, the more testing you can do, the better your go live, the better the implementation is going to be. So count on doing some really good testing. Along with that, you need to define a process for remediation. Right, so once you're in testing, you now have to figure out, how am I going to remediate this stuff? Typically, if you've been live for quite a while, there are transport limitations. Right? We're only going to do transports once a week. We're going to only move stuff to production once a month. Before this even happens, before your go live, you need to fix that with change management. Right? You have to move this stuff faster than the normal transport process. and you need to be able to streamline that. So get involved with it. Think about that before you start even go down this road with the testing and the go live, right? Make sure your transport process is in place. It's usually emergency transports, but you have to work that process out before you go live. All right, and your role owner and audit considerations. What are the sign-off requirements? What does your company require before you go live or before you can even make a change, right? Again, who's responsible for maintaining that documentation? So when audit comes in and says, hey, who authorized you to make this change, right? And typically there's a ticketing system that you can refer to. Use in the role, use the description field. At the very beginning of the role, there's a description field. When you make a change to a role, put the date, time, and the ticket number in there so you can go back and reference it. You don't have to try and dig through archives of your ticketing system to try and find where somebody told you it was okay to make this change. And then that brings us to the next subject. If you're, again, SU24, if your SU24 values are not maintained correctly, or you have folks putting manually inserted objects and authorizations into the system, or you've changed the standard from SU24 in the role, when you go out and do the read old, merge new, you're going to get a lot of things that come into that role that aren't just from the change you're authorized to make, right? You can get stuff that comes in from a bunch of other different areas because somebody in your system isn't maintaining the roles correctly with using SU24. Well, problem with that is now you are on the record in audit as being the person that brought that stuff in, even though it's not related to your change that you were authorized to make. So you have to maintain that. You have to be on target with doing that. And then what is the audit review that's required? What kind of audit, is there an audit review required before you go to production? Okay. And then we talked about documentation. What does your company and industry require for security documentation? We talked a little bit about GDPR and where they're now starting to ask for documented RFC connections that have GDPR access, right? That's one of the things they come in and start asking now is for the documented RFCs. Do you even do that? Do you know who does that? Is it basis team's requirement? Is it a security team requirement? Is it the business that's required to keep that documentation? All things you have to figure out. Also, in your testing of changes, what is the documentation that you're required to maintain for testing when you do this? And then typically a finalized security concept and controls document is required. It's typically required by the end of your phase, your testing phase, when you're doing a role redesign. And it basically sets how you're going to define how you're going to set up your security. What are the naming standards? Are you going to allow developer keys in anything other than development? What's the process? What are your standards around the SAP standard delivered IDs, DDIC, TMS Atom, those kind of things? What is the security that we're going to put around those? Are the passwords locked? Is the IDs locked? Is the passwords changed? Not easy to guess? Those kind of things. You typically have to document all of that in some sort of a document. The auditors will ask for that when you go in. If you're doing a redesign, they typically want that and they want to see that you're in compliance with that before they allow you to go live. Okay, so that's usually required right after testing and right before go live. That's usually your go, no go type meeting. And then we have another poll.
All right, and that's my cue, I guess. So we're gonna start last poll of today, and that is, are you planning a role redesign project anytime soon? It seems like almost an even split between yes this year, sometime in the future, and no plans. So we'll share the results here in a second. All right, we're going to close the poll and share the results. That's almost an even split. Interesting. And with that, Jeff, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay. All right, and so now we're ready for wrap up. So if there's any questions, let me hold off on the questions real quick. The webinar, so we have another webinar. It's February 28th at 1:30 Eastern, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. There's the email where you can, or the website where you can register for it. And that's really going to focus on everything we just talked about, but using the exciting authorization management suite to help you do that in a much faster and easier process with your next role redesign. I believe this is going to be part of the recording, so you can go through this when you need to. We'll talk about the SAP service for RFC optimization, how we can help you with RFC optimizations, that kind of stuff. There's just a list of links, so useful links and references for our series. We have some blog series on SU24. Those are very good. The blog series for SU24 by Julius. If you're not sure about how SU24 works, I highly recommend reading those blogs. They're very good. We have a security challenge, so you can learn new stuff every month and win stuff. We give away lots of different things. I think we're giving away this month, this month we're giving away passes to the SAP Insider Conference, I believe. I could be wrong. Michael will jump in a little bit and say if we are or not, if I'm misspoken. There's some references on use cases that we've done in the past with some other companies. Just go out and hit some of these websites if you have more questions. One of the members of our team, Alessandro Banzer, who's our CEO, helped co-write a book about SAP security. That's available at SAP Press. And then if you need to get hold of Michael, here's all his information. So feel free to spam him all you want. He loves spam.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So with that, we can
questions.
get to questions. Yeah. So one of the non-technical question was, can we get a hold of the slide deck? And yes, the answer is yes. So we had a couple of folks, and we unfortunately hit our limit again. So not everyone could join, and some folks had security issues with downloading the GoToWebinar plugin, etc. And so yes, we'll send out an email with the link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck. So if you couldn't see Jeff's screen and only dialed in, or if you just would like to get a copy of that, we'll make that available as well. Probably within the next 24 hours. So as soon as the recording is done, we'll put it into an email and send it out. And those were, I think, all the administrative questions. Now, from a technical perspective, we had a bunch. Let me just dig in here and see. One question, for instance, was, can you tell me the standard transaction used for checking custom code vulnerabilities? So I think you've mentioned SAP native capabilities to do that.
SAP has one, and I am not familiar with the transaction to do that. I can certainly look it up and answer that after the meeting. I can look it up. They have a code scanner. Typically, most companies, however, have a third-party code scanning tool that they use. They don't typically use the SAP one. Now, SAP has a bolt-on that they just came out with not long ago, maybe last year, that you can use that it greatly enhances the code scanning, but you have to pay for it, and it's quite expensive, I understand. But it's a very good code scanner. I believe a lot of people use Virtual Forge, and I don't know some of the other. Almost everybody has a code scanner. But I'll look up the SAP one and get you that information.
Okay, another question was not necessarily technical, but not administrative either, and that is regarding licensing. So if we have any documentation or where we can find information on SAP stance on licensing, based on authorizations. And let me just explain here a little bit, because there is still a lot of information out there, and SAP has kind of changed its course over the last couple of months. So I think it was 2 years ago at the German SAP event, which is similar to the SAP user group. The German SAP user group, basically they have an annual event, and in their SAP announced the change to authorization-based licensing. And we have a copy of that slide deck where they explain exactly what they want to do. Unfortunately, it's in German. By the time all the information came here to the US, SAP kind of backpedaled a little bit and said, you know what, maybe we're not going to do it just based on authorizations. There's going to be some usage involved as well. And I'm not sure if the final word on that has been spoken yet. So we can certainly make available a German slide deck, but unless you speak German, it might not be super helpful. But there are also a couple of links on asac.com. Most of those are related to indirect licensing, but there's also some information on the authorization versus usage-based licensing, and I'll try to dig that up and send it over. The next question was, or more like a concern, what if we missed updating SU24 and we already went live? What shall we do? I guess, what's the best practice?
The best practice is as you make changes to your roles, you can go through and, when somebody asks you to add a T code, or you get an SU53, anytime you get an SU53 issue with a role, you should go back and immediately look at SU24. Because typically you want to make sure that that object is actually being considered for the transaction that it's being run under. And then you'd have to decide if whatever the missing field values were, right? So whatever the authorization values were, should those be added to that transaction in SU24? But typically it's your SU53, your change documents are good triggers for looking at SU24. And you can also go back and anytime you do a support pack upgrade or you do an actual upgrade, you can always go through SU25 and run I think is it 2D? There's a step in there, 2A through 2D, something like that, where you can go through and see if there's any impacted roles for your stuff. When we talk about our tool at the next session, we provide a whole list of ways to do this, and I'll go through that pretty heavily because we're such big fans of SU24. And I'll show you how our tool can help you do that easily on a regular basis.
All right, and then I think we have an answer to the previously asked questions in terms of what's the T code for the SAP native code scanner, and one of the attendees replied with SCI or ATC. I assume that was in relation to the code scanning.
Okay.
All right, then let's see what else we got. We got a ton of questions, so we're probably not going to be able to go through all of them, but I promise we'll answer every single one and reply. Another one is into what category do master derived roles fall? Is it a single role concept, or does that belong to composite, or what's the deal?
Single role. They're
Okay.
single role.
All right.
So typically you have a master role and then you replicate it. It can be you can put those roles certainly in composites, but I wouldn't do that. I would certainly leave them in a single role kind of concept, because in the end of the day, they're just SAP roles like everything else. The derivations just have to do with the org values, right? So you can assign the single role anywhere you want, whether it's a composite or someplace else. Just know that with a composite, it's it branches out, right? So it's your maintenance nightmare again, and that's typically what happens with your composite roles.
Okay. The other question was in regards to single roles and job roles. Doesn't that lead to duplicate transactions in those various roles, and wouldn't that make testing and maintenance harder in the long run?
Can you read the question again? The first part of it?
Yeah, so with single roles or job roles, you'll likely end up with duplicate transactions, meaning transaction A you may have in 10 different or 100 different roles. Doesn't that make testing and maintenance more difficult?
Testing, no, because you typically don't test multiple job roles at the same time, right? So if somebody is in a certain job, say accountant, they get the accountant role, right? The single accountant role, and that's what they test. They're not going to get somebody else's job role to test, right? They're going to test the one role. Maintenance wise, yes, you're absolutely right. It does cause a little bit more maintenance, but I personally am okay with that. I'll trade off maintenance because if your SU24 values are correct, and if your role is built correctly and it's using SU24 and everything's at the menu and you don't have anything manually inserted, you don't have all the change statuses, so all your authorizations are nice and clean, the maintenance isn't a big deal to me. I can wing through a bunch of roles really quick and make updates because I know they're built correctly. The problem when the maintenance comes into issue is when your roles aren't built correctly, because then it becomes a nightmare of, God, I added this and now it's bringing in all this other stuff. So testing, no. Testing, you basically test the job role by itself. Maintenance, it's a little more work, but personally, if the role's built correctly, I don't see that as a problem. I'll take maintenance, a little more maintenance over transparency any day of the week.
Okay,
So I'll inherit the maintenance.
What I should have added is during upgrades. if it's more work, specifically during upgrades.
No, definitely not. It's the same amount of work. It doesn't matter. You're still having to test everything. It doesn't matter if you're, I mean, if you're sharing roles across the board, yeah. I mean, theoretically, the testing could be a little bit longer. But especially, and I'm going to basically jump off scope a little bit, but when you use our tools, um, it doesn't add any difference at all. It doesn't make any, when you're using, we'll talk about it next webinar, but just know that if you're using the right tool, or if your roles are built correctly, it shouldn't add much in the way of testing, especially in upgrades. It shouldn't be a big deal.
Okay. And speaking of tool, one question was, can we get a trial version of the tool that you've referenced a few times? And yes, the answer is yes. And please reach out to me if you don't hear from me before. We can certainly make that happen. Another question was, can I add a single role into multiple composites?
Yeah, that's the whole that's the whole concept. Most of your single roles do go into multiple composite roles. That's in point in fact, that's the problem with composite roles. Is typically a single role is shared across multiple composite roles. And the problem is now when you have to make a change to that single role. When you make a change to that single role, it now impacts all of the composite roles that it's shared across. And you may not want that change. And that's when the administration becomes a lot tougher.
Okay. And another question for a client during an upgrade, SU25 was missed. What is the best practice to fix the authorizations or the authorization issues in production?
You can do it one of two ways. If you have a sandbox, if you can make a copy of your production system in a sandbox environment and do it there to see what kind of impact it would have, that would be the best way to do it. If you can't, back up your SU24 values, so it's the USOBT tables. I believe in SU25 there's a step that's like 6D or something where you can actually back up the customer changes to your tables, and then just go run the SU25 again. Go run the 2D or 2A through 2D steps directly in development, and then make sure you do the post maintenance. It shouldn't impact anything big, and again, it's going to be heavily dependent on how bad your roles are built. If there's a lot of manual stuff and that kind of stuff, it could cause some problems. But or you can simply just wait till your next upgrade and do it as part of your next upgrade, because you have to do it anyway.
Next question is, how can you gauge the impact on security during an SAP application version upgrade?
How can you again, SU24 for me, it's SU24. When you do the version upgrade, you have to basically go through SU25 and complete steps 2A through, I keep saying 2D, and there may be a couple of more steps in there now, but it's 2A through at least 2D. And one of the steps is when you do that, it shows you all of the impacted roles. So any changes that were made to the default values, it'll come out and it'll show you all the roles that are impacted and what you have to change. So SCP in the Su25 transaction has a way to do that. You can go through the steps to do it.
Okay. And then the last question, and I think we'll wrap it up in, and what is the difference between ECC and S4 in regards to role design and authorization data?
SAP, and that's kind of a long explanation, but I'll try and do it as quick as I can. SAP is going to what they call the concept of one. You're going to start seeing it a lot more in a lot of their presentations at TechEd and that kind of stuff. It's called the concept of one. What they're really trying to do is they're trying to get away from having multiple transactions that do the same thing, like create vendor, create customer, that kind of stuff. Hence the BP transaction in S4. So for S4, it's still an ABAP stack. You just have a lot of new transactions, and you have a lot of transactions that are going away. And that's really the simplification list. You have to go through that. Other than that, the biggest impact between the two is going to be Fiori. They're really pushing Fiori hard. The old SAP GUI, they've been talking about it for 20 some odd years about getting rid of SAP GUI, and now I think they're finally going to be there. So Fiori is really going to be, because you're going to have to build roles in both the Fiori front end and in the back end ABAP stack. And that's really going to be your big difference, is you have roles now in two places that you have to build. And the Fiori front end isn't built like the back end. It's a different, it's catalogs and tiles and services and a bunch of different things that you have to deal with. I believe the class that, if you're interested in that, SAP has a class that you should take. It's the ADM 945 class, which talks about HANA and Fiori and how the security works. That's a really good class to take to get that difference. In the back end, though, it's still ABAP. Front end is where you're going to get the difference in how the two connect.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we are at exactly 2:30 Eastern. So thank you very much again, everyone. I promise we're gonna answer all of your questions, even the looks like 500 we didn't get to. So watch out for an email with the recording, the copy to the slide deck, as well as answers to your questions. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jeff.